Okay, we have arrived at the final few chapters of Michael Schwab's Sociologically Examined Life. And as a part of that discussion of chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12, I wanted to introduce you to one of the famous symbolic interactionists, Erving Goffman. So Goffman is most famous for his work on the idea of dramaturgy and impression management, and his book is called Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Goffman, just like the other symbolic interactionists, believed that we make meaning through our interactions, and he believed that we create an interaction order, right? A context in which we determine the rules of behavior with one another. So for instance, with my students, I would have an interaction order as your teacher. And so if I walked into the class and started telling you about my love life, it would be very awkward, inappropriate, right? Because that's not part of our interaction order. So essentially, what we do in the immediate presence of others very much determined by the context of that interaction. Goffman uses the term dramaturgy, right? Just like Shakespeare would say, all of life is a theater. And he focused on how individuals take on roles. So we've already discussed in sociology, roles are really important. We occupy roles, we interact through these roles of teacher, student, parent, citizen, etc., etc. And we act these out in the presence of our audience, and we want to make a favorable impression on our audience. And Goffman argues that people are interested in controlling how others view us. And that's the process that he calls impression management. We like to manage the impressions that we make on our immediate others. It's interesting that Goffman's work has then been developed by other sociologists like Arlie Hochschild to talk about how this not only extends to management of our behavior, the language we use, how we carry our body, how we chew our food, the clothes we wear, the mannerisms we take on, but it extends to our emotions. And so Arlie Hochschild calls that emotion management. Goffman was talking more about our behavior, but Michael Schwalbe also talks about the emotion work we put in, right? So think about how if you're at a funeral, maybe you didn't know this person well, and you get a serious case of the giggles, right? And in those moments, you have to almost make yourself feel sad, because giggling at a funeral would not be very appropriate. You can also think of many examples where you might be with your loved ones and you're tired after a whole day and you have to almost will yourself to be interested in hearing how their day was and so on and so forth. Right? So there's a lot of emotion work. You know all about emotion work if you are in any kind of customer service, right? That you have to always put up a smile because the customer is always right. So there are some questions to ponder with this, right? Especially in a culture in the US where we put a lot of value into impression management. You have to make the right impression. You are your own brand, right? So if life is like theater, are we con artists or just actors? To some extent, we are all engaging in impression management, but where do we draw the line between the impressions we're giving out and our authentic self? right? So that's definitely a question to ponder. Also, what do we value in our culture? Is it content or style? Most folks would believe that content is really important because simply having style without any content is not sustainable, right? But at the same time, style also becomes really important. I think about this a lot as a scholar, and there might be really interesting ideas and concepts I have in my head, but unless I frame it in an accessible manner, I'm not going to be a very effective teacher. So often we make the argument that the best scholars don't necessarily make the best teachers, right? So you have to know how to communicate that information. Now, I wanted to connect Goffman's idea of impression management with Schwalbe's chapter of creating images. Because Schwalbe is making this really important point that while all of us to some extent are engaging in impression management, right? For instance, I would never use curse words in front of my parents. But if I'm with my high school buddies, then the occasional F-bomb might be dropped, right? So we change our language, we change our clothes. Folks researching this find that we kind of make ourselves smaller, literally physically in size, in the presence of our boss or someone who's in a more dominant role. Schwalbe adds on a layer to that analysis by pointing out that the resources that you need to make a good impression, whether it's clothes or a particular kind of language, whether it's cultural resources, right, like an educational degree, whether it's your race or class or gender, these are all differentially distributed in our society. So that's a really important point to keep in mind, that dominant groups, right, and when we say dominant groups, men in our society can give out the impression they want to, right, as good leaders, and so on. Women often face the catch-22, right, where they might not be seen as assertive enough, or they might be seen as too bossy, right? Similarly with race, if you're part of the dominant group, you're seen as competent, trustworthy, professional, etc. If you're not part of the dominant racial group, you may be seen as unprofessional, too loud, harder to work with, etc. And again, these are not just feelings, right? This is based on data. In fact, African Americans in our society will point out that they have to put in a lot more effort into creating the impressions that they want to, right? Because sometimes just wearing a hoodie can be incredibly dangerous to you. You don't have control over who sees you as threatening versus non-threatening, right? Some of my black women friends point out that just to run out to the store to go get milk, they will make sure they have a little bit of makeup, they'll never run out in their sweats, because it affects the way that they are treated in stores. So stereotypes become a really important way in which images are created in our society, right? And so for this module, I'm assigning The Danger of a Single Story that you'll watch, the TED Talk by Chidamamba Adichie, and she'll point out to you that stereotypes, more than anything, are just incomplete images, right? They're not multidimensional, they're often unidimensional, and therefore they omit the humanity from certain groups of people, right? We fail to see certain groups as multidimensional, complex human beings, right? Their subordinate status becomes their master status. The moment I say to you, Muslim woman, At that point, the stereotypes flood in. You forget, is this person a neuroscientist? Do they like watching Seinfeld? Do they like eating PBJs? No, you just start seeing a Muslim woman, perhaps who wears a hijab, and immediately you're thinking, maybe she's oppressed, maybe she's traditional, maybe she's very fundamentalist in her beliefs, etc. Right? So the master status overshadows all other aspects of the identity. This is where it becomes problematic, right? Because we indeed rely on images and accounts to construct reality. Especially if we are living in segregated societies, if we are relying on media stereotypes, then we get very narrow images. That's why media images are so important, right? Because that's our primary tool of pedagogy, of learning about folks that we may not encounter in our everyday lives. So when those images are distorted, that's what we internalize, right? That's how we see black and brown men as predators, right? That in turn shapes both the policy against them as well as our empathy and reaction to essentially the murders of black and brown men by law enforcement, right? We still see them as criminals. We see black children as not quite children, right? Because we are bombarded with these images of black folks as threatening. There's also the important absence of information and representations. For instance, most of us had not heard about the black women mathematicians at NASA until the book and the movie Hidden Figures came out, right? And those kinds of omissions are devastating because black and brown children don't have any examples of this in the popular culture and not in the curricula either, which is why we keep insisting that we need to have a robust ethnic studies program. Because the way we teach history, the way we teach about these representations and images is very Eurocentric, right? And again, that shapes our reality. In the final chapters, Schwalbe is also talking about power, right? And these discussions are really important because he's making distinctions between power that is through coercion versus power that comes through consent, right? And he's pointing out that power doesn't necessarily arise out of powerful personalities, but it arises out of a conjunction of circumstances and situations, right? And he gives the example of Germany, that it wasn't just Hitler, right, that led to this Nazi regime, but the political, social, economic circumstances in Germany after the defeat in World War I, the national humiliation, and then this rise of nationalism, especially among the youth, that Hitler was then able to exploit, right? And so whenever we are thinking about these powerful personalities, we have to think about the circumstances that give rise to these powerful personalities. We will talk more about this difference between power through consent versus coercion in our next portion.